My name is Thomas Adler. I spent 11 years as a Forest Service ranger in the Tongass National Forest, the largest national forest in the United States. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest sprawling across the Alexander Archipelago and the coastal mountains of southeast Alaska. Most people have never heard of it. Most people couldn't find it on a map. That's by design, I think. Not ours, something else's. In those 11 years, we logged 41 incidents that couldn't be explained through standard protocols. Not lost hikers. We find lost hikers. Not animal attacks. We understand animal attacks. I'm talking about events that don't fit in any box the Forest Service provides. 41 incidents in 11 years. 14 of those involved personnel who never came back. Not killed, not found dead, just absent from the world, as if they'd been subtracted from it. I need you to understand something before I tell this story. I'm not a superstitious person. I have a degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. I spent 4 years doing elk population surveys in the Bitterroot before I transferred to Alaska. I'm the kind of person who needs data. I need to observe, record, and replicate before I believe anything. That's what made the Tongass so hard for me. Because what I observed, I could never record properly, and what I recorded, no one could replicate. But I observed it, over and over and over again. The rules exist because people like me kept observing things that killed people who didn't know any better. And eventually, someone, I don't know who was first, decades ago, maybe longer, decided to write down what they'd learned. Not in any official capacity. You won't find these rules in any Forest Service handbook, any training module, any government database. They exist on a laminated card that gets passed from one ranger to the next when you're assigned to the Tongass interior stations. Mine was handed to me on my first day by a man named Dale Purcell, and the card was soft at the edges from years of handling, the lamination peeling at one corner like dead skin. I still have it. I'm looking at it right now. I transferred to the Tongass in March of 2014. I'd requested the posting. That's important. Nobody forced me to go. I wanted it. After the Bitterroot, I wanted something bigger, something remote, something that would fill up the empty space that had opened in my life after Rebecca died. Rebecca was my wife. Pancreatic cancer. 8 months from diagnosis to funeral. She was 34. I was 36. We'd been married for 7 years, and I'd spent most of them in the field, counting elk and fixing fences and doing the work I told myself mattered more than being home. After she was gone, home didn't exist anymore. Just a house with her things still in the closets, because I couldn't open them without smelling her shampoo, this coconut thing she used that I'd always told her smelled too sweet. So I applied for the most remote posting I could find, the Tongass interior. Specifically, the Kupreanof district, a section of forest on the eastern half of Kupreanof Island that sees maybe 200 visitors a year, most of them hunters or researchers passing through. The station was a 40-minute float plane ride from Petersburg, the nearest town with a grocery store. In winter, you could go 3 weeks without seeing another human face. That was what I wanted. To be alone in a forest so large and so indifferent that my grief would seem small by comparison. I should have been more careful about what I wished for. The float plane dropped me at Duncan Canal on a Tuesday in March. The water was steel gray and perfectly still, reflecting the tree line like a mirror someone had laid on the ground. Sitka spruce lined the shore, enormous trees, some of them 300 years old, their branches draped with pale green moss that hung like wet curtains. Behind them, deeper in, western hemlock and red cedar packed so tightly that 20 feet from shore it was already twilight, even at 2 in the afternoon. The pilot, a guy named Frank Atwood who ran charters out of Petersburg, killed the engine and let the pontoons drift against the wooden dock. He didn't shut down the way you normally would, post-flight checks securing the aircraft taking his time. He kept the master switch on. "Your ride's up the trail," he said, pointing toward a gravel path that disappeared into the trees. "Quarter mile. Dale'll be waiting." I grabbed my duffel and my pack. "You're not coming up?" Frank looked at me, then looked at the tree line. "I don't go past the dock." I waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. He just watched me with an expression I'd later learned to recognize on the faces of people who knew about the Tongass interior. A specific kind of patience, like they were watching someone walk toward a door they knew led somewhere bad, but couldn't bring themselves to explain why, because the explanation itself sounded insane. "All right," I said. "Thanks for the ride." "Keep your radio charged," he said. Then he reached over, pulled my door closed, and started his engine before I'd made it 10 steps up the dock. I listened to the plane take off behind me as I walked toward the trees. The engine noise bounced off the water, off the mountains, echoed once, twice, and then was gone. And what replaced it was something I wasn't prepared for. Silence. Not quiet. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture, that you can feel against your skin like humidity. In the Bitterroot, there was always something. Wind in the grass, birds, insects, the distant highway hum that you stop hearing after a while but your brain still registers. Here, the trees absorbed everything. The moss absorbed everything. The air itself seemed to swallow sound the way dark water swallows light. My boots on the gravel path sounded obscenely loud, each step a violation of something I couldn't name. I stopped walking. I stood there on that path, my duffel over one shoulder, and I listened. Really listened the way I'd been trained to listen during wildlife surveys, not for a specific sound, but for the acoustic signature of the environment, the baseline frequency of a place. There was no baseline, there was nothing. The silence wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence, something actively filling the space where sound should have been. I could feel it pressing against my eardrums the way deep water presses against a diver. I'd been in remote wilderness for years. I'd spent nights alone in the Bitterroot backcountry where the nearest road was 30 miles away. I knew what real quiet sounded like. This wasn't that. This was something else. Something that made the hairs on my forearms stand up before my conscious mind could articulate why. I started walking again, faster. The trail curved through old-growth spruce, the trees so massive they blocked what little sky was left. Moss covered everything, the ground, the trunks, the rocks, the deadfall logs that lay across the forest floor like the bones of things that had fallen and been slowly absorbed. The green was overwhelming. Not the cheerful green of a garden or a meadow, a green so deep and so saturated it looked almost black in the shadows. A green that had been growing and dying and growing again for 10,000 years without human interruption. I found the station at the end of the trail, a wooden structure, maybe 1,200 square feet, elevated on pilings with a metal roof gone rust brown from the rain. A covered porch ran along the front, and on that porch stood a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same wood as the building. Dale Purcell was 61 years old and had been stationed in the Tongass interior for 23 years. He was lean in the way that people get when they've been burning more calories than they consume for decades. Not thin, not gaunt, just reduced to essentials. His hair was gray and cut short, his face weathered to the color of old leather, and his eyes had a quality I'd seen in long-service combat veterans, but never in a park ranger. A sustained, low-grade alertness, as if some part of him was always listening for something beyond the range of normal hearing. He watched me approach without moving. His hands were in his jacket pockets. A coffee mug sat on the porch railing, steaming. "Thomas Adler," he said, not a question. "Yeah, that's me. Dale Purcell. I'm your training officer for the next 6 weeks." He picked up his coffee, took a sip, set it back down. "You'll sleep in the east room. Wood stove works, but the chimney needs cleaning, which you'll do tomorrow. Radio room is on the left. Don't touch the HF set unless I show you how. It's old and temperamental, and parts take 4 months to order." "Understood." He studied me, not the way a supervisor sizes up a new employee, more the way a doctor evaluates a patient. "How was the flight in?" "Fine. Quick." "And the walk up?" I hesitated. I almost said it was fine. Something in his expression stopped me. He was waiting for a specific answer, and I had the sudden clear sense that how I responded would determine something important about our working relationship. "It was quiet," I said. Dale nodded slowly. "Yeah, it is." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a laminated card, roughly the size of a playing card, but thicker, the edges soft from years of handling. He held it out to me. "Read this. Read it twice, then we'll talk." I took the card. The text was typed, not handwritten, an old typewriter font with uneven key strikes, reproduced through some copying process that had degraded the image slightly. At the top, someone had written in pen, "Kuprayanov Station, Interior Protocols, Supplemental." Underneath were 8 rules. Rule 1. Between the hours of last light and first light, do not respond to any sound that comes from the forest. This includes voices, animal calls, mechanical sounds, and your own name. If you hear it, you did not hear it. There's nothing to respond to. Rule 2. If you encounter a section of forest where no birds are singing and no insects are audible, leave the area immediately. Do not stop to investigate the cause. Walk. Do not run. Back to the last point where you heard normal ambient sound. Mark the location on your map with a red triangle and report it during your next radio check. Rule 3. Do not follow tracks that appear in fresh snow or mud if the tracks lead away from any established trail and toward the interior. This applies to all tracks, including human boot prints, regardless of their apparent urgency or recency. Rule 4. If you see a figure standing motionless among the trees at a distance greater than 50 yards, do not approach it. Do not call out to it. Do not observe it through binoculars or a scope. Avert your gaze and leave the area. If the figure is closer than 50 yards, do not break eye contact until you have retreated to a structure or vehicle. Report the sighting using the red triangle protocol. Rule 5. If your radio produces a transmission that uses your full name and provides specific instructions, regardless of the voice, the call sign, or the apparent authority of the transmission, do not comply until you have verified the source through the landline at the station. The radio can be compromised. The landline cannot. Rule 6. Do not enter the drainage basin southeast of the station, locally known as the Muskeg Corridor, between October and April. During these months, the area is closed to all personnel regardless of circumstance. If a missing person report places a subject in the Muskeg Corridor during closed months, log the report and do not initiate search operations. Contact the district office in Petersburg. Rule 7. If you experience a period of lost time, arriving at a location with no memory of traveling there, or discovering that hours have passed without your awareness, report immediately to your partner or, if alone, to the district office via landline. Do not attempt to retrace your steps. Do not attempt to recall the missing time. Document only what you know, where you were, where you are, and how much time is unaccounted for. Rule 8. The silence is not empty. Do not assume that because you see and hear nothing, nothing is present. The forest has residents that do not announce themselves. Behave at all times as though you are being observed, because you almost certainly are. I read the card twice, as instructed. Then I looked up at Dale. He was watching me with that same evaluative expression, patient, waiting. "Is this a hazing thing?" I asked. Dale didn't smile. "Does it look like a hazing thing?" "It looks like someone typed up a list of campfire stories and laminated them. That card has been at this station since before I arrived. The woman who gave it to me, her name was Margaret Okalik, 20-year veteran, Tlingit woman who grew up on this island. She told me the same thing I'm going to tell you. The rules are non-negotiable. They're not guidelines. They're not suggestions. They are the conditions under which you operate in this forest. And if you break them, I cannot guarantee your safety, and more importantly, I cannot guarantee mine." "Dale, let me finish." His voice hadn't risen. It didn't need to. "You're here because you requested a remote posting, and your file says you're competent and experienced. I believe that. I also believe that nothing in your experience has prepared you for the Tongass interior. This forest is different from any forest you've worked in. It operates under different rules, literally. And the sooner you accept that what seems irrational is actually the most rational response to an irrational environment, the better your chances of lasting past your first winter." I looked at the card again. The type was slightly crooked on the page, as if whoever had typed it was in a hurry or their hands were unsteady. The lamination had a small air bubble near Rule 6. Who wrote these? Nobody knows. Margaret said they existed before her, maybe the original station personnel back in the 50s or 60s. They've been updated over the years. Rule 5 used to reference a CB radio, but the core list has been the same for as long as anyone remembers. And people actually follow them. The people who are still here follow them. The people who didn't follow them are the reason the rules exist. He let that settle. Then he picked up his coffee, drained it, and nodded toward the door. Come inside. I'll show you the radio, the stove, and the filing system. In that order, because those are the three things that will keep you alive. I followed him in. The station was sparse but functional. A main room with a desk, a wood stove, and a wall of topographic maps. A small kitchen, 2 bedrooms barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker, and a radio room with a battered HF transceiver, a VHF handheld charging station, and a landline phone that connected to a buried cable running down to the dock and then undersea to Petersburg. The landline was analog. Dale told me it had never malfunctioned in 23 years. The HF acts up, he said, tapping the transceiver's housing. Especially in winter, you'll get transmissions from fishing boats, other stations, sometimes military frequencies bleeding through. That's normal. What's not normal is a transmission that knows your name. If you hear your name on this radio and you didn't initiate the contact, you step away from the set and you come find me. Clear. Clear. He showed me the filing system next. 2 metal cabinets, locked, keys on a ring that he wore on his belt. One cabinet held standard Forest Service paperwork, maintenance logs, wildlife surveys, visitor permits. The other held what Dale called the supplemental files. Red triangle reports, he said. Every incident that falls outside normal parameters. Sightings, sound events, lost time episodes, anomalous track findings. Everything goes in here, dated and signed. I send copies to the district office twice a year. They file them somewhere. I don't know where, and I've stopped asking. I pulled open the drawer. It was full. Not just full, packed. Hundreds of reports, handwritten and typed, some on modern Forest Service forms, some on older paper yellowed at the edges. I pulled one at random. A handwritten report from 2007, Dale's careful block printing. 0347 hours, vocalizations from southwest, bearing approximately 210 degrees, distance estimated 400 to 600 meters. Female voice repeating phrase, "Please help me, I'm hurt," at approximately 15-second intervals. Consistent volume and cadence regardless of estimated distance. No variation in inflection across 23 repetitions. Timed. Voice ceased at 0412. No corresponding missing person reports. No tracks found on morning patrol of Southwest Quadrant, filed under Rule 1. I looked at Dale. 23 repetitions, I said. You counted. I always count. It helps you stay analytical instead of emotional. You hear a woman screaming for help in the dark, your training says go help her. Your training is wrong out here. Counting gives your brain something to do besides make bad decisions. And in 7 years since this report, has anyone identified the source? Dale took the paper from my hand, slid it back into the drawer, and closed it. The source isn't something you identify, it's something you survive. I thought about pressing him. I didn't. Not because I believed him, but because I recognized something in his face that I'd learned to read during my years in the field. The expression of someone who has decided to give you exactly as much information as you can handle, and not one word more. Margaret Okalik had presumably done the same thing to him 23 years ago. There was a rhythm to this, a protocol for the transfer of knowledge that was as much a part of the station as the radio or the stove. That first night, I lay in my cot in the east room, listening to the stove tick as it cooled and the rain patter against the metal roof. The forest outside was invisible. No moon, no stars, just clouds sitting on top of the canopy like a lid pressed down on a jar. I'd lived in plenty of remote places. I'd spent nights in the Bitterroot, where the silence was so deep I could hear my own blood in my ears. This was different. The silence here was active. That's the only word I have for it. It wasn't the absence of noise. It was the suppression of it, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay there and I could feel it against the walls of the station, pressing in from every direction, dense and absolute and patient. At 2:17 in the morning, I heard a branch snap outside. A single, clear crack, the sound of dry wood breaking under weight. I sat up in my cot. The sound had come from the west side of the station, maybe 30 yards into the tree line. I waited. Nothing followed. I lay back down. I thought about Rule 1. Do not respond to any sound that comes from the forest. A branch snap. That's what I was supposed to ignore. A sound that any wildlife biologist would catalog as a deer, a moose, a porcupine, a falling limb. Mundane, ordinary, not worth losing sleep over. Except that in the 3 hours since sunset, I hadn't heard a single animal sound. No owls, no rodents, no night birds, nothing moving in the understory, nothing calling, nothing breathing. The branch snap had come from inside the silence. Something had made a sound where no sound was being made. And somehow, that simple fact was worse than any voice or scream or cry for help could have been. I lay there until dawn, watching the ceiling, listening to nothing. Morning changed everything. It always did in those first weeks. Daylight in the Tongass, when it came, filtered and gray through the cloud cover, restored the world to something comprehensible. Birds sang. Ravens called from the canopy. A Stellar's jay screamed at us from the porch railing while Dale made coffee on the propane stove. "Sleep all right?" he asked, handing me a mug. "Fine," I lied. Dale gave me a look that said he knew I was lying and wasn't going to make an issue of it. He drained his coffee standing up, the way people do when they've already planned their day down to the minute, and said, "We're patrolling the North Loop today. 6 miles, mostly boardwalk through Muskeg. Bring rain gear, bear spray, and your radio. Keep the radio on channel 4 and don't change it." We spent the next 6 weeks like that. Dale taught me the trails, the maintenance routines, the wildlife survey protocols that actually were in the Forest Service handbook. We checked culverts and bridges for storm damage. We inventoried emergency caches positioned along the main trails, waterproof boxes bolted to platforms, each containing first aid supplies, emergency blankets, flares, and a laminated copy of a map that showed the trail system with red triangle zones marked in grease pencil. I counted 9 red triangle zones on the map. Dale told me there were more, but some had been stable for so long they'd been downgraded to monitoring status. "What does stable mean?" I asked. "Means the silence in those areas hasn't expanded in 5 years or more." I looked at him. "It expands." Dale kept walking. Sometimes, the Muskeg Corridor, Rule 6, was half its current size when Margaret started. By the time she retired, it had grown to cover the entire drainage basin. That's why it's closed October through April. The expansion is seasonal. "What expands, Dale? The silence?" He stopped on the boardwalk and turned to face me. The muskeg stretched out around us, a flat expanse of sphagnum moss and stunted shore pine, open to the sky in a way that felt almost wrong after the claustrophobia of the old growth. His face was calm. His eyes were not. "I'm going to tell you what I know, and I want you to hear it as a professional observation, not as a story. I've been here 23 years. I've observed patterns. The silence, the absence of ambient sound that you noticed your first day, is not uniform. It exists in zones. Those zones have boundaries. The boundaries shift. In general, the zones are smaller in summer and larger in winter. In general, the zones are concentrated in the old-growth interior. In general, things that happen inside those zones don't follow rules that make sense outside of them. Things like the voices. Voices, visual phenomena, track anomalies, lost time." He paused. "Physical displacement." "What does that mean?" "It means people end up places they didn't walk to." He turned and started walking again. I stood on the boardwalk for a moment, looking out across the muskeg. The sky was low, a flat gray ceiling maybe 400 feet above us, and the stunted trees at the far edge of the clearing stood like figures in a Bruegel painting, dark and motionless. I followed him. Over those 6 weeks, Dale gave me the information in pieces, never all at once, never more than I'd asked for, and never in response to my asking, always when he decided I was ready. He had a system. I'd witnessed something small, something that pricked at the edge of normal, and then that evening or the next morning, he'd offer the context. On our second week, we were hiking the South Ridge Trail when I noticed something that stopped me mid-step. A section of forest below the ridge, maybe 200 yards away, was completely still. Not just still, dead still. The rest of the canopy around it moved in the wind, branches swaying, moss swinging gently. But this one section, roughly the size of a football field, was frozen. The trees didn't move, the moss didn't move. Even the rain, which had been falling steadily all morning, seemed to avoid that area. I could see it falling all around the perimeter, but not inside it. "Dale," I said. He'd already seen it. He'd pulled his GPS out and was marking the coordinates. "How long has that been there?" I asked. "Wasn't there last week." He finished marking the point and put the GPS away. "We'll report it at next radio check. Red Triangle Protocol. Come on." He kept walking. I followed, but I looked back twice. The second time, I could have sworn the boundary of the still zone had shifted closer to the ridge trail. Not by much, maybe 30 feet. But the tree that had been just outside it, a large hemlock with a distinctive broken top, was now inside, its branches as motionless as everything else in that dead zone. That night, Dale poured 2 bourbons. He'd never done that before. Whatever he was about to tell me required both of us to be slightly lubricated. "But the zones aren't random," he said, sitting in the chair by the stove. "They appear, grow, stabilize, and sometimes disappear. The ones that disappear usually reform somewhere else within a few months. The permanent ones, the Muskeg Corridor, the area around Portage Bay, the Upper Caw Sheets drainage. Those have been documented since the 1960s at least. Margaret told me the Tlingit communities knew about them long before that. They had names for those places. Not names you could translate into English, exactly. More like descriptions of what happened to you if you went there." "What happens?" Dale swirled his bourbon. "What Margaret told me, and this was from her grandmother, who heard it from her grandmother, is that the forest in certain places is occupied. Not by animals, not by spirits exactly, though that's the closest English word. By something that was here before the trees, before the ice. Something that doesn't move the way we understand movement and doesn't communicate the way we understand communication. It exists in the silence because the silence is what it's made of. The absence of sound isn't a symptom. It's the thing itself." I drank my bourbon and said nothing. This was the kind of story I'd heard variations of in every forest I'd ever worked in. Indigenous communities had their traditions, which I respected. But I was a biologist. I dealt in data. "You're sitting there thinking this is folklore," Dale said. "I'm sitting here keeping an open mind." "Good. Keep it open. You'll need it." He set his glass down. "I want to tell you about a man named Ronnie Sayers. He was my first partner here. Ex-Navy, tough as nails, didn't believe a word Margaret told us. Lasted 9 months. What happened? He broke Rule 3. November, first heavy snow. He found boot prints on the South Ridge Trail, fresh, leading off-trail toward the interior. Looked like someone had walked straight into the forest. He figured it was a lost hunter. Reasonable assumption. Ronnie was a reasonable man." Dale paused. He looked at the stove for a long time. "He followed the tracks about 400 yards. I know because I tracked his prints the next morning. His prints went in. They didn't come out. The boot prints he was following, the ones that looked like a lost hunter, I followed those too, as far as I could. And here's what I found. Those tracks went in a circle. A perfect circle, maybe 50 yards in diameter, walking around and around the same loop. Not like someone confused or disoriented. The stride was consistent, the spacing even, the depth uniform. Like a machine. And the center of that circle was inside a silent zone that hadn't been there the week before. And Ronnie? Ronnie's tracks followed the boot prints to the edge of the circle and then continued straight into it. His last visible print was at the boundary. After that, nothing. No tracks, no marks, no disturbance. As if the ground inside the circle had never been walked on. You searched. We searched for 11 days. Dogs, helicopters, ground teams from Petersburg and Juneau. Nothing, no body, no clothing, no equipment. His pack was found on the trail where he dropped it before following the tracks. His radio was still in it, turned on, battery full. Dale picked up his bourbon again. That was 1994. Ronnie Sayers has never been found. His file is still open. The official classification is missing, presumed dead, cause undetermined. The supplemental file is 3 inches thick and classified under Rule 3. We sat in silence. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the silence, the real silence, the one that pressed against the walls, filled the space the rain had left behind. I could feel it the way you feel barometric pressure dropping before a storm. A physical weight. "Dale," I said, "if this is real, if these zones are what you say they are, why does the Forest Service still staff this station? Why not just close the area?" He looked at me with something close to surprise, as if the question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding. Because if we're not here, nobody watches the boundaries, nobody tracks the expansion, nobody warns the people who come through. We're not here because the Forest Service understands what's happening. We're here because someone has to stand between the silence and everything else, and we're the ones who volunteered. He stood up, washed his glass, and set it upside down on the rack. "Get some sleep, Thomas. We're checking the Portage Bay perimeter tomorrow, and it's a long hike." He went to his room and closed the door. I sat by the stove for another hour, turning the laminated card over in my hands, reading the rules again and again. 8 rules. 8 lines between survival and whatever had happened to Ronnie Sayers and the 13 others in those files. The bourbon was gone. The stove was cooling. Outside, something that wasn't wind and wasn't rain and wasn't any sound I could name pressed against the station walls and waited. I went to bed. I did not sleep. At some point in the early hours, so quiet I almost missed it, I heard my name. Not from the radio, not from Dale's room, from outside, from the tree line, spoken once in a voice that sounded like Rebecca's. I did not respond. I lay in my cot with my hands flat at my sides, fingers pressed into the wool blanket, and I counted my heartbeats until morning. I lost count at 412. By my 3rd month at the station, I'd stopped thinking of the rules as absurd. I hadn't fully accepted them, but I'd moved from skepticism to what I'd describe as operational agnosticism. I followed them not because I believed they were necessary, but because the cost of following them was zero and the cost of not following them was potentially everything. It's the same logic that makes you wear a seatbelt. You don't expect to crash, but you buckle up. Dale noticed the shift. He didn't comment on it directly. That wasn't his way. But he started sharing more. Not lore, not stories, but data. His data. 23 years of meticulous observation compressed into conversations on long hikes and quiet evenings at the station. The silent zones moved on roughly seasonal patterns, expanding in winter and contracting in summer, but with year-to-year variation that suggested responsiveness to factors Dale hadn't identified. They were more active, his word, during periods of low barometric pressure. They avoided moving water. Streams, rivers, tidal channels. The zones never crossed them. The zones preferred old-growth forest, particularly areas with dense canopy cover, and almost never appeared in muskeg or alpine environments. Almost never. The muskeg corridor is the exception, Dale said. It shouldn't be there based on every other pattern I've documented. Old-growth avoidance, water avoidance, open sky avoidance, the corridor breaks all of them, and it's the biggest zone on the island. That's why it has its own rule. What's different about it? Dale shook his head, not a refusal, a genuine absence of answer. I don't know. Margaret's grandmother called it the oldest place, said it was the first zone, the original. The others might be extensions of it, maybe, or imitations. I don't know. I wrote everything down. I had a field notebook, standard issue, green cover, waterproof paper, and I filled it with observations, measurements, timestamps. Where Dale recorded incidents in the supplemental files, I recorded the spaces between incidents, the baseline behavior of the zones, their edges, their movements, their rhythms. I was still a biologist, I was still looking for data, but the data was starting to look back. In June, Dale took a week of leave to visit his daughter in Sitka. It was the first time I'd been alone at the station. The first 3 days were fine. Summer in the Tongass is as close to benign as the place gets. 16 hours of gray daylight, temps in the mid-50s, the forest alive with birdsong and the constant background hiss of rain. I ran my patrols, checked the caches, filed my reports. The silent zones on my survey route were at their summer minimums, barely detectable. I walked past areas that in winter would have been dead quiet and heard perfectly normal forest sounds, varied thrush singing, squirrels chattering, the drum of a woodpecker. On the 4th night, I was in the radio room logging my evening observations when I heard something on the HF set. The radio was on, but I hadn't been transmitting. I'd been monitoring the weather frequency out of habit, the automated voice reading wind speeds and barometric pressure in its flat mechanical cadence. The weather broadcast cut out, mid-sentence. The automated voice stopped, and for 3 seconds there was nothing but carrier static. Then a voice came through the speaker. "Thomas Adler, Kuprianov Station, come in." It was a woman's voice, professional. The cadence was right for a dispatch call, clipped, clear, authoritative, but the call sign was wrong. Our dispatch went through the Petersburg office, and they used Kuprinov Base, not Kuprinov Station. A small detail. The kind of detail you might not notice if you weren't listening for it. I was listening for it. "Thomas Adler, Kuprianov Station. We have a missing person report, your area. Please respond with your current status." I stood up from my chair. My hand was halfway to the transmit button before I stopped. Rule 5. If your radio produces a transmission that uses your full name and provides specific instructions, regardless of the voice, the call sign, or the apparent authority of the transmission, do not comply until you have verified the source through the landline. I walked to the landline. My hands were steady. I picked up the receiver and dialed the Petersburg district office. It rang 4 times. "Petersburg Dispatch, this is Collins. This is Thomas Adler, Kuprianov Station. I'm receiving an unverified transmission on the HF set, requesting response to a missing person report in my area. Can you confirm?" A pause. I heard Collins typing. "Negative, Kuprianov. We have no active missing person reports in your district. No transmissions have been sent to your station this evening. What frequency are you receiving on?" I told him. He asked me to stand by. I heard him conferring with someone in the background. "Kuprianov, we recommend you power down the HF set and rely on VHF and landline until your training officer returns. Log the incident under supplemental protocols. Do you understand the supplemental protocols?" "I do." "All right. Collins out." I hung up the landline and walked back to the radio room. The HF set was still on, still broadcasting the same transmission on loop. The woman's voice, patient, professional, repeating the same request every 15 seconds. "Thomas Adler, Kuprianov Station, come in. We have a missing person report your area. Please respond." I powered down the set. The voice stopped. The silence rushed in to fill the space it left behind, and I felt it settle around the station like something lowering itself into a comfortable position. I sat in the radio room for a long time. Then I opened my field notebook and wrote down everything. The time, the frequency, the exact words, the wrong call sign, the cadence, the duration. I counted the repetitions I'd heard before powering down. 14. Consistent interval, consistent volume, consistent inflection. Like a machine. Like boot prints walking in a perfect circle with even spacing and uniform depth. Like something that had studied how people communicate and learned to replicate the shape of it without understanding the substance. I thought about Ronnie Sayers following boot prints into the trees. I thought about how reasonable it must have seemed. A clear trail, fresh snow, someone obviously in trouble. Every instinct says follow. Every year of training says help. And the forest takes those instincts, those good human life-saving instincts, and uses them as bait. Dale returned from Sitka on a Friday. I told him about the radio transmission while he unpacked. He listened without interrupting, which I'd learned was how he processed things that concerned him. The more serious the information, the quieter he got. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "It used your full name," he said. "Yes." "First and last." "Yes." He opened the supplemental file cabinet and pulled out a folder I hadn't seen before. It was thinner than the others, held together with a rubber band, and the tab was labeled in red ink. Rule 5, Radio Events. "In 23 years, Dale said, I've had 11 radio events. The first one used my call sign, just Kuprinov, and gave generic instructions. No name. That was in 1996. The most recent one before yours was in 2012. It used my first name." He looked at me. "It took 16 years to learn my first name. It learned your full name in 3 months." The words hung in the air between us. Outside, a varied thrush was singing its single haunting note, a sound like a tuning fork struck and held until the vibration dies. It was the most beautiful and the most lonely sound in the forest, and in that moment, it felt like the only real thing left. "What does that mean, Dale?" He put the folder back and closed the cabinet. "I don't know. Maybe it means it's getting better at what it does. Maybe it means you brought something with you that it's interested in." He paused, looked at me with those careful, measuring eyes. "Maybe it means the silence has been listening to you more closely than it's listened to anyone in a long time." He locked the cabinet and put the keys back on his belt. "Keep your landline charged. Keep your notebook current. And Thomas," he stopped at the door of the radio room. "If you hear Rebecca's voice from anywhere, at any time, do not answer. No matter what it says, no matter how much it sounds like her, it isn't her." I felt something cold move through my chest. I hadn't told Dale about the voice I'd heard my first night. I hadn't told anyone. "I never mentioned Rebecca to you," I said. Dale looked at me for a long moment. Something passed across his face. Not surprise, not guilt, sadness. "No," he said, "you didn't." He left the room. I heard him open the stove, add wood, close it again. The fire crackled. The thrush sang outside. I sat at the radio desk and looked at the powered-down HF set, its dials dark, its speakers silent. My reflection stared back at me from the dead glass of the frequency display, distorted, darkened, not quite right. And somewhere out beyond the walls, out past the porch and the gravel and the tree line, in the space where sound went to die, something that knew my dead wife's name settled in to wait. Summer collapsed into autumn the way it always does in southeast Alaska, not gradually, but in surrender. One week the alders were green, and the salmon were still running silver in the creeks. The next, the leaves had gone yellow overnight, and the rain turned cold and horizontal, driven by storms that came off the Gulf of Alaska like something angry had sent them. The silent zones began their expansion. I tracked them daily now, something Dale and I had formalized into a monitoring protocol. Every morning, I'd hike to the nearest zone boundary, the one along the South Ridge, and mark its edge with flagging tape tied to branches. Every morning, the tape from the previous day was further behind the boundary than it should have been. The zone was growing at roughly 8 to 12 feet per day, consuming forests the way a slow tide consumes a beach, silently, inevitably, without any mechanism I could identify. By mid-September, the South Ridge zone had expanded far enough to be visible from the station porch. I could stand there with my coffee and see the line, the place where the trees still moved in the wind and the place where they didn't. It wasn't dramatic. You had to know what you were looking at, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. A border running through the forest like a scar, separating the living from the still. Dale began doing something I'd never seen him do. He started checking the locks twice before bed. Not the front door. We never locked the front door. There was no one to lock it against. The supplemental file cabinet. Every night, he'd check it once, walk away, come back, check it again. When I asked him about it, he said, "Habit," in a tone that made it clear the conversation was over. The first week of October brought the season's first real incident. A research team from the University of Alaska Fairbanks had been permitted to conduct a fungal diversity study along the east shore of Duncan Canal, about 3 miles from our station. 4 researchers, well-equipped, experienced in field work. They'd checked in with us on arrival, standard protocol, and Dale had given them the visitor briefing, which was a sanitized version of the rules. Stay on marked trails, don't hike after dark, report anything unusual. He didn't give them the card. He never gave civilians the card. "Too much information makes people curious," he told me once. "Curious people investigate. Investigating people disappear." On their 3rd day, one of the researchers, a doctoral student named Yunseo Park, came to the station alone. She was calm, but the kind of calm that comes from suppressing something that wants to be panic. I recognized it. I'd been wearing that same calm for months. "Something happened on our transect today," she said. She was sitting at the kitchen table, holding a mug of coffee Dale had poured for her. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. "Tell me," Dale said. "We were running our sampling grid about 2 miles east near the creek system that feeds into the canal. Standard procedure, soil cores, bark samples, photographing fruiting bodies. Around 11 this morning, we entered an area where the forest changed." "Changed how?" She took a breath. The sound stopped, all of it. We'd been hearing ravens, a woodpecker, the creek, normal sounds, and then nothing. Like someone had turned the volume down to zero. Dr. Massey, our PI, she noticed it first. She stopped walking and held up her hand, and we all just stood there, listening to nothing. Dale and I exchanged a glance. He gave me a small nod. "Keep listening." "We should have left," Yunseo said. "I know that now, but we didn't." Dr. Massey wanted to document the acoustic anomaly. She's a mycologist, but she was curious. She had her recorder running and she wanted to get a measurement of the silence. We stood there for maybe 5 minutes, and then David Chen, one of the other grad students, said, "Does anyone else see that?" She set her coffee down. Her hands had started trembling. There was a woman standing in the trees, maybe 60 yards away. She wasn't moving. She wasn't facing us. She was facing away toward the interior. She was wearing a red jacket, the kind you'd buy at REI, and jeans. Normal clothes, normal person. Except she wasn't moving, not at all. Not breathing that I could see, not shifting her weight, not adjusting her footing. She was standing the way a mannequin stands, like she'd been placed there. "Did anyone call out to her?" Dale asked. David did. He shouted, "Hey, are you okay?" And she didn't react. Nothing. David started walking toward her and I grabbed his arm. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Something about the way she was standing made my skin crawl. He shook me off and took maybe 10 steps in her direction. She stopped, picked up the coffee, put it down again without drinking. The woman turned around, but she didn't turn. She rotated. Her feet didn't move. Her legs didn't move. Her body just pivoted from the hips like a door swinging on a hinge. And her face, Yunseo closed her eyes. Her face was wrong. I can't tell you how. The features were all there. Eyes, nose, mouth. But the proportions were off, like someone had described a human face to a sculptor who'd never seen one. And she was smiling. Not a normal smile. Too wide. Using too many muscles. The smile went past where a smile should stop. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, a raven called once and went silent. David stopped walking. He came back to the group. We left. We walked back to our camp and we haven't gone east since. I came to tell you because Dr. Massey won't. She thinks it was a person with a medical condition or a stress hallucination. She's already rewriting it in her head. But I saw what I saw. And I don't think it was a person. Dale thanked her. He asked her to describe the exact location, which I marked on our map. It was inside the South Ridge Silence Zone, the one I'd been tracking, the one that had been expanding 8 to 12 feet per day. The research team's transect had walked them right into it. After Yunseo left, Dale added a red triangle to the map and wrote up the report in his block printing. I watched him work. His hand was steady, his letters precise. He might have been filling out a maintenance log. "Dale," I said. They walked into the zone. 4 people with no training, no awareness, no rules. Yes. And it showed itself, in daylight, at 60 yards. Dale put down his pen. It's testing. The zones expand, the entity's behavior becomes more overt. I've seen this cycle 4 times in 23 years. It pushes boundaries, gets bolder, approaches closer, uses new methods. He capped the pen. Then it takes someone and it pulls back. Takes someone. Or someone leaves the area. I don't know if it distinguishes between the two, but after a disappearance, or after the population in its range decreases, the zones contract. The activity diminishes, sometimes for months, like it fed, or like it lost interest. You're describing a predator. I'm describing a pattern. I don't know what it is. I know what it does. We evacuated the research team the next day. Yunseo went willingly. Dr. Massey protested, her study, her funding, her timeline. Dale told her there was a safety concern with the trail system and the area was being temporarily closed. Standard bureaucratic language delivered in Dale's flat, unchallengeable tone. She complained. She filed a grievance with the district office. But she left. David Chen, the student who'd walked toward the figure, sat in the float plane with his hands between his knees, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken since the morning after the incident. Yunseo told me he'd woken up at 3 a.m. that night, standing at the edge of their camp facing east in his socks. He had no memory of getting out of his sleeping bag. Rule 7. Lost time, physical displacement, people ending up places they didn't walk to. I watched the float plane lift off Duncan Canal, and I thought about David Chen standing in his socks at the edge of camp, facing the direction of the thing in the red jacket, and I thought about how easily the rules could fail if no one was there to enforce them. October deepened. The days shortened to 9 hours, then 8. Rain turned to sleet. The silent zones continued their expansion, and now I could hear the difference from inside the station, the periods of absolute quiet growing longer, the intervals between bird calls stretching, as if the living sounds of the forest were being pushed into a smaller and smaller space. On October 28th, I experienced Rule 7 for myself. I went to bed at 10:15 p.m. I remember this because I logged it in my notebook, which I'd started doing compulsively, time-stamping everything, creating an unbroken record of my movements and mental state. I lay down, pulled the blanket up, closed my eyes. The stove was warm. The rain was steady on the roof. Normal. I opened my eyes and I was standing on the porch. It was dark. Not station dark, where the glow from the stove window gives the main room a faint orange cast. Outside, dark. The kind of dark where you can feel the trees around you even though you can't see them. I was wearing what I'd gone to bed in. Thermal shirt, wool pants, socks. No boots, no jacket. My feet were wet, not from rain, from mud. I looked down. My socks were black with it. I'd walked somewhere. I'd walked off the porch, across the gravel into the mud and back. Or I'd been about to walk further and something had stopped me. I didn't know which, and that uncertainty was worse than either answer. I went inside. I checked the clock. 3:47 a.m. 5.5 hours unaccounted for. My field notebook was on the desk where I'd left it, but it was open to a page I hadn't written on. The page was blank except for a single line, in my handwriting, in my pen. She says she's cold. I don't remember writing that. I don't remember anything between closing my eyes at 10:15 and opening them on the porch. But the handwriting was mine. The pen was the same one I always used, and the mud on my socks traced a path from the porch steps to a point roughly 15 feet from the tree line and back. I called Dale on the landline. It was 4 a.m. and he picked up on the first ring. I told him everything, the time gap, the mud, the notebook. The line was quiet for a long time. She says she's cold, Dale repeated, in my handwriting. Thomas, I need to tell you something I should have told you earlier. Margaret Okalik, my training officer, she had a son, Michael. He drowned in the canal when he was 14, years before she came to the station. The entity used his voice, called her name, called out, Mom, asked her to come to the water. She never went. Not once in 20 years. But in her last year at the station, she started finding notes, her own handwriting, things Michael used to say, things only she would know. What happened? She retired, moved to Juneau. She's still alive, far as I know. She told me that leaving was the only way to break the connection. Once it learns you well enough to move your body while you sleep, it doesn't stop. It escalates. It tests how far you'll go, how close to the tree line, how close to the zones, how close to saying yes. Dale didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was different, quieter. The voice of someone reaching into a part of themselves they normally keep sealed. Margaret told me something the day she left. She said the hardest part wasn't hearing Michael's voice. The hardest part was that she wasn't sure the entity was lying. She wasn't sure Michael wasn't actually cold, somewhere in that silence, waiting for her to come find him. And she had to leave without ever knowing. I sat with the phone against my ear and I thought about Rebecca, about her voice coming from the tree line on my first night, about the note in my handwriting. She says she's cold, and I felt it, the pull. Not a physical force, a gravitational certainty, like standing at the edge of a cliff and feeling the void below you whisper that falling would be easier than standing. I didn't go to the tree line. I didn't go outside. I cleaned the mud off my socks, closed the notebook, and sat by the stove until dawn, counting the seconds between each tick of the cooling metal. I lost count somewhere around 2,000, and I started over. And I kept counting because counting was the only thing between me and the door. The rest of that winter was the longest of my life. The silence zones reached their maximum expansion in January, and from the station, I could no longer hear any natural sound at all for hours at a stretch. The forest pressed in, enormous and still and watching, and I patrolled and maintained and reported and followed the rules with the mechanical precision of someone who understood that the rules were all that stood between them and a void that wore his dead wife's voice. I had 2 more episodes of lost time. Both followed the same pattern. Went to bed, woke on the porch, mud on my feet, something written in my notebook. The second note said, "Come outside, it's so quiet here." The third said, "You promised you'd find me." I had never promised Rebecca I'd find her. There was nowhere to find her. She was cremated. Her ashes were scattered in the Bitterroot. But the entity didn't need the truth. It needed something close enough to make me hesitate, and each time, the hesitation lasted a little longer. Spring came in April, 6 weeks later than it would have in Montana. The silent zones contracted. Birds returned to areas that had been dead quiet for months. The pressure eased. I could stand on the porch and hear ravens again, and the relief was so profound, I sat down on the steps and cried for the first time since Rebecca's funeral. Dale found me there. He didn't say anything. He sat down next to me and we listened to the ravens together, 2 men on a porch in the rain, grateful for the sound of something alive. In May, Dale told me he was putting in for retirement, 24 years. He'd be 62 in September. "It's time, he said. "The knees are going, the back," and he paused, poured coffee, drank. "I'm tired, Thomas. I've been tired for a long time." "I know. You're ready. You know the forest. You know the rules. You know what to watch for, and you know what not to do when it happens." He looked at me. "You also know the cost. I want to be honest with you about that. This job takes things from you, not all at once, a little at a time over years, sleep, certainty, the ability to sit in a quiet room without your heart rate climbing. I used to love silence. Now it makes me sick." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a key ring, the supplemental file cabinet keys. He held them out. "Margaret gave these to me in '93. I'm giving them to you now. Everything I know is in those files. Everything I've observed, documented, reported. It's not enough. It's never enough, but it's what we have." I took the keys. They were warm from his pocket. One more thing," Dale said. "They'll send you a new ranger. Someone young, probably. Someone who requested the posting because they want adventure or solitude or distance from whatever's chasing them. You'll give them the card. You'll give them 6 weeks. And you'll watch their face when they read the rules, and you'll see yourself, and you'll want to tell them everything all at once so they'll be ready." "But I won't?" "No. You'll give it to them in pieces, same as Margaret did for me, same as I did for you. Because the pieces are the only way it sticks. They have to see it before they can believe it. That's not stubbornness. That's how the human mind protects itself from things it wasn't built to process." Dale left on a float plane in June. I stood on the dock and watched him go. Frank Atwood was flying, same pilot who'd brought me in 2 years before, still refusing to walk past the dock. Dale waved once from the window. The plane lifted off the gray water of Duncan Canal, banked south toward Petersburg, and disappeared behind the ridge. I walked back up the trail alone. The forest was summer green and alive, and the silent zones were at their minimums, and a Steller's jay screamed at me from the same branch it screamed from every morning, and for a moment, the Tongass was just a forest, just trees and rain and birds and the ordinary and different machinery of the living world. That moment lasted until I reached the station porch and heard, very faintly, from somewhere deep in the old growth southeast of the clearing, a varied thrush singing a note that was almost right. Almost. The pitch was correct. The duration was correct. But it was too even, too consistent. No bird sings the exact same note twice. There's always micro-variation, the tiny imperfections that mark something as alive. This note had no imperfections. It was a perfect copy of a varied thrush, performed by something that had listened long enough to learn the shape of the song but didn't understand what made it real. I went inside. I closed the door. I sat at the desk and opened the supplemental file cabinet with my new keys. The new ranger arrived in August. Her name was Claire Matsuda, 28, wildlife biology degree from Oregon State, 3 years with the Forest Service in the Cascades. She'd requested the posting. She wanted something remote. She'd recently lost her father. I could see it in the way she held herself, a careful architecture of composure built over something that hadn't finished breaking. I met her on the porch, handed her coffee, watched her look out at the forest with the same expression I'd worn 2.5 years earlier. Awe layered over ambition, layered over the specific loneliness of someone running from grief into geography. I pulled the laminated card from my jacket. The edges were softer now, the lamination peeling a little more than when Dale had given it to me. I held it out. "Read this," I said. "Read it twice, then we'll talk." She took it. She read it. She looked up at me with narrowed eyes. "Is this a hazing thing?" I didn't smile. "Does it look like a hazing thing?" And there it was. The cycle. Margaret to Dale, Dale to me to Claire. The same card, the same words, the same disbelief, meeting the same certainty on the same porch in front of the same forest. I could feel the weight of it, the lineage of wardens stretching back decades, each one broken in just the right way to understand what they were guarding and why it mattered. I'm still at Kuprianov Station. It's been 11 years now. Claire lasted 4 before she transferred to a desk job in Juneau. I trained 2 more after her. The current one, a young man named Emeka Obi, is in his 2nd year and asking the right questions at the right pace. He'll be okay. I think he'll be okay. The silent zones are larger than they were when I arrived. The Muskeg corridor has expanded by nearly a 1/4 mile in every direction since Dale's retirement. The South Ridge zone now reaches to within 200 yards of the station on bad nights in January. The Red Triangle reports have increased by 40% over the past decade, and the district office in Petersburg has started asking questions I can't answer honestly without sounding insane. I still hear Rebecca's voice sometimes, winter nights when the silence is at its deepest, and the zones have swallowed every sound for miles. She calls my name from the tree line. She says she's cold. She says she's been waiting. I don't go to the door anymore. I haven't gone to the door in years, but I listen. I always listen. I lie in my cot with my hands flat at my sides, and I count my heartbeats, and I listen to the voice of a woman who's been dead for 13 years say my name with a tenderness that nothing in that forest should be capable of. And every time, for just a moment that gets no shorter no matter how many years pass, I wonder if the rules are wrong. I wonder if she's really out there, somehow, in the spaces between the trees where sound goes to die. I wonder if all I'd have to do is open the door and walk 50 yards into the dark, and I'd find her, standing there in the silence, waiting for me the way I should have waited for her when she was alive and I was in the field counting elk instead of sitting beside her bed. I don't open the door. That's the job. That's the whole job, standing between the silence and everything at once, and choosing every night not to open the door. If you're planning to visit the Tongass, the real Tongass, the interior, the parts that don't show up in the tourism brochures, I need you to listen to me. Stay on the marked trails. Don't hike after dark. And if you find yourself in a part of the forest where the birds have stopped singing, and the wind has stopped blowing, and the rain has stopped falling, and the world has gone so quiet you can hear your own blood moving through your veins, turn around, walk, don't run. Get back to where the sound is. Don't investigate. Don't be curious. Don't be brave. The silence is not empty. It has never been empty, and it is very, very patient. I know because I've spent 11 years watching it wait, and in 11 years it has not blinked once.